guys, so I'm here to film a video that I thought might be rather interesting. I certainly thought it was interesting kind of putting together the data for, and that is my most read authors. Now, obviously the authors that appear on this list are going to have written a lot of books. Some of my favourite authors haven't perhaps written tons and tons of books, so that kind of already stopped them getting onto this list, which is why I wouldn't necessarily say this is like my best authors of all time. But it is certainly a reflection of authors that I love, because I wouldn't have read so many of their books if there wasn't something about their writing that I didn't thoroughly enjoy. And it's such an interesting list because it's quite all over the place in terms of genre, and also when I've read different things at different parts of my life. I've also got authors on here who I've loved books by, but some of the books I've read by them I haven't. So without further ado, I thought I'd just, crack on, tell you about all the authors that I have read the most by, what I think of them, perhaps what my favourite book by them is, and just chat a little bit more with you. I will say, however, I have not included authors like J.K. Rowling, who obviously I've read more than 7 books by, because I've read like the little companion books to Harry Potter and stuff, but because they're all set in the world of Harry Potter, I just decided to leave them off. I've generally speaking included authors where I've read more than one series, if they're a series writer, or at least like a series in a standalone by. So on that topic, the first author on this list will probably come as no surprise, and that is Terry Pratchett. Now, most of the books I've read by Terry Pratchett are in his Discworld series, because most of the books he wrote were in his Discworld series. I think he had 40 books in that series, and I have read 30 books by him in total, 28 of which are Discworld books. I actually thought I'd read more Discworld books, but from looking at my Goodreads, I don't think I have, which in a way is quite exciting because it means I still have 12 Discworld books to read, and I absolutely adore his Discworld novels. If you are looking for a specific video on where to start with Discworld, I'll link the video I did a few years ago down below, because I think everything I said in that still stands. But in terms of my favourite books by him, they are the Discworld ones. The other books I read by Terry Pratchett were 2 of his sort of middle grade YA books. I'm not quite sure what age category they fall into, but I read them when I was sort of like pre-teen, early teen, and that is Johnny and the Bomb and Johnny and the Dead, which were great fun. I actually would be interested to read them again as an adult, because they were very early in my journey into Terry Pratchett, and they were fun, but they haven't really stuck with me. It is the Discworld books that I come back to again and again. So many books in his Discworld, which is a planet he created to set this fantasy world on, a disc that sits on the back of 4 elephants riding on the back of a giant turtle called a tune through space, and they're like comical fantasy full of like puns, and they are brilliant. I love them, and the love of the Discworld was something I very much shared with my dad, who first introduced me to these books. And my first introduction actually came with Small Gods, but I think I was a little young when I read that. I was around 10 and none of it made sense to me. I then later, maybe a year or so afterwards, read The Wee Freemen, which is his YA series set in the Discworld. So I think all the other books in the Discworld are adult, but the Wee Freemen series, or the Tiffany Aching series, is YA, and I was obviously more like age compatible with that book, and it really made me fall in love with his worlds. So to this day, The Wee Freemen is one of my absolute favourites, but my absolute favourite, like without a doubt, hands down, is Going Postal. I reread that book on quite a regular basis. I love everything about it. It's so hilarious, and it's the first in a 3-part series, because the Discworld, although a world that Terry Pratchett has created, the books within it kind of have their own series, which is something I explain a little bit more in the video that I'll link down below. But Going Postal begins its own series. I also adore Equal Rights. I think that's an amazing place to start. It was the 3rd published Discworld book. It stands alone perfectly and is a great introduction to the world. So those are probably my favourites by him, but I think it's fair to say Terry Pratchett is one of my favourite authors, and I'm quite pleased to say that he is at the top of this list. I then realised when I was making this list that I was definitely going to have to include some authors I haven't read in quite a few years, because they're authors I adored as a child and consumed so many books by. Now, if you grew up, I think, like in the 90s and the early 2000s, I don't know, potentially now still, because she's still writing, then you probably read Jacqueline Wilson, like me. Every other friend I have grew up reading Jacqueline Wilson. She, generally speaking, writes children contemporary novels, although she has like forayed into like slightly more like magical or like science fiction-y elements. They're all very much rooted in the contemporary world, and they always deal with quite hard-hitting issues. She dealt with like bullying, eating disorders, like absent parents, mental health, growing up in foster care. Her books were just incredible, and I'm sure still are incredible. I haven't picked up a Jacqueline Wilson book since I was, again, probably in my early teens, although like I said, I've noted that she keeps bringing them out. Maybe that would be another interesting thing to do, read some of Jacqueline Wilson's more recent novels now that I'm an adult. I think, like many young women, the Girls series was one that made a big impact on me. It was slightly older than some of her other books, like maybe for pre-teens, you know, sort of preparing you for all of the drama of teenage years, and that was the one that dealt with like dating, friendships, eating disorders. And in fact, now I'm just remembering there was an incident in one of the books where there was some really creepy guys that kind of they ended up in a threatening position with. It was really unsafe, and that was probably a great thing for a book that I was reading at that age to cover. But other than that, I think some of my favourites by her that I read repeatedly were Vicky's Angel, The Suitcase Kid, Bad Girls, and one of my absolute favourites is a more younger reader one that she wrote that was illustrated, and I don't know a lot of people that have also read The Monster Storyteller. Oh, and how could I forget The Cat Mummy and Glub Slime? Okay, that sounds really strange, but I think Glub Slime was my absolute favourite. Now this one is about a little girl who finds a familiar, this speaking toad, and wants to learn how to become a witch, although there's not really a lot of actual magic in the book. It's basically about her trying to win back her friend who's found another friend, and she feels that this other friend has stolen her away, but perhaps maybe during that journey she'll find that they can all be friends, and it's so sweet. And I love the little magical speaking animal element to it when I was a kid. But all in all, I actually read 21 books by Jacqueline Wilson, if my records are correct. Obviously I wasn't keeping Goodreads at the time, but I tried to go back and add all the ones I remember reading, so 21 is what I remember reading. There could potentially be some that I've forgotten about. I read a lot as a child. But if you read Jacqueline Wilson as a child, let me know which one your favourite was. We then have Charlaine Harris. Now, I enjoyed the books I read by Charlaine Harris, but I would not put her on a favourite author list. The reason I've read so much by her is because one of her series that I have completed has 13 books in it, and it is the Sookie Stackhouse series, which was the basis for the TV show True Blood, if you remember that. So this is a like adult paranormal mystery romance series set in the American South, where vampires have come out of the closet. Vampires have revealed to the world that they are real, and they are now trying to coexist with humans whilst drinking synthetic blood. And we follow Sookie Stackhouse, who, despite seeming like an ordinary human, is telepathic, and she doesn't quite know why she's telepathic, but she finds it very stressful because she's like overwhelmed by other people's thoughts constantly, until she meets her first vampire, Bill Compton, who she can't hear the thoughts of because he's a vampire and he's dead. And because of that, they start a relationship. But things just spiral from there. Like I said, there's 13 books in this series. So much happens, so many more magical creatures become apparent. It's a lot of fun. I think by the end of 13 books there's been a lot of repetition, but they are just quite fun, like immersive escapist books with a lot of like mystery plot lines embedded in there. And actually they're probably one of the first kind of romance series I ever read without really thinking about them as romance. And they're good fun, don't get me wrong, they're just not the best books I've ever read. I've then also read one other book by Charlaine Harris, which is why she got on this list, and that is Real Murders, book 1 in the Aurora Teagarden series. This again is quite similar. It's basically a like mystery romance series, although I've only read book 1 without the paranormal elements in this series. We follow Aurora Teagarden, a like small town librarian who's also part of a Real Murders group, where her and some other residents in this town meet every now and then to discuss real murders and talk about their theories about how they happened, or maybe unsolved murders, or whether they believe what the police ended up concluding. It's basically like this true crime collective, and they just like to burrow into old murders. But of course there is a real murder. In fact, there's a series of murders in book 1, and Aurora gets tied up in solving those murders whilst also being part of sort of like her love triangle. Like I said, there's like this romance element to it, and that was good fun. I've always kind of meant to go back and read book 2, but with so many other books to read, it's never seemed like a priority. But all in all, that means I've read 14 books by this author. We then have two authors who are tied with 12 books each, and I'm sure you will not be surprised by either. Number one is, of course, Juliet Marillier. Yes, she made it onto this list, and I have read 12 books by her, which is kind of incredible since I only started reading her in 2018. And I'm quite proud of myself to have read so many, but thankfully she still has more. I've not read them all yet because that would be kind of devastating to have no more new Juliet Marillier. But as I've mentioned many times before, Juliet Marillier writes the most gorgeous, like detailed fantasy historical novels. So most of what I've read by her has been set in medieval Ireland, although I have also read a bit of a series that's set in like an ancient version of Scotland and one that's set in Romania. So they're not all in Ireland, but I would say like the vast majority of them are. And she always does the most gorgeous job of describing the landscapes and all of the lore surrounding these places and the historical settings. They are quite slow paced in general. She does have some YA books which are a little bit more fast paced and just gorgeously like drawn out, and every detail is beautiful. But the books I've read by her have come from 5 different series and 1 standalone. So she doesn't have a lot of standalones. I think she only has one, and that is Heart's Blood, which is actually a retelling of Beauty and the Beast, something I'm a bit of a sucker for when it comes to fantasy retellings, and I did very much enjoy this one. So if you prefer a standalone, especially as an introduction to an author's writing, I think this one is really excellent. It's not my favourite book by her, but I still think it's a really good book. It's a really interesting retelling of Beauty and the Beast with a lot of complexities and differences that makes it very unique. But we then have my favourite series by her, the one I talk about most often, and that is the Seven Waters series. So this is one of those series where every book follows a different protagonist. There are 6 books in all, and I have read 5, so I only have 1 left, and I have been so reluctant to read book 6 purely because the thought of having no more Seven Water books makes me really sad. I love these books so much, but at the same time I think once I've read book 6 I will just enjoy the pleasure of going back to book 1 all over again, because I would really like to reread them. And book 1 is Daughter of the Forest, of course, which is a retelling of the Six Swan Brothers fairy tale, but it's basically the story of Sorcha, a young woman that she starts off with as a girl and grows up a little bit as the book goes on. And she's basically set on a quest to save her brothers when an evil sorceress puts a spell on them, and it is the most beautiful book. Like, I absolutely love Sorcha, her like quiet, soft inner strength, her relationships with the other characters, her love for her brothers and her family, her interactions with the fair folk, as well as like a romance that does eventually come into play. And just could not recommend this book more highly. In saying that, part of me kind of loves book 2 even more. Son of Shadows is all about one of Sorcha's relatives, so I don't want to say too much more than that, but each book in the Seven Waters series follows another woman who's part of the Seven Waters family, as Sorcha was. So we then follow a new woman in that family in book 2, book 3, book 4, book 5, and as I am quite aware, also in book 6, and they each have their own journeys, they each have their own personalities, and although it's lovely to return to that same world and understand all their family connections, I always enjoy being introduced to a new woman in this family, and she always has like a really wonderful storyline. I have then also read the first book in her latest series, Harp of Kings, which I really enjoyed. That book only came out last year, and I cannot wait to follow this series in real time as they come up. This is another medieval Irish one, as Seven Waters is, but set a little bit later. Technically they're set in the same world, but they are separate series. They're not connected, and you don't need to read Seven Waters before you read Harp of Kings. Similarly, I've read all 3 books in the Blackthorn and Grimm series, which is also set in the same world, and in the timeline is set between Seven Waters and Harp of Kings, but again is its completely own series. So I hadn't even got to book 5 of Seven Waters before I read Blackthorn and Grimm, and that's the only series by her I've actually completed. It's a trilogy, and what I think makes this series particularly unique is that it really has quite like a detective element to it. In each book we follow the same 2 main characters, Blackthorn and Grimm, that have their own dark pasts but manage to find like solace and friendship in one another, then go off travelling and find themselves living in a kingdom with a mystery to solve, and then in each of the second and third books there's a new mystery, so I really enjoyed that. And then, like I mentioned, she does have some YA books, and I've read 2 of those. one of which is Wildwood Dancing. That's part of a duology and it's the series set in Romania. This one is again, well, it's actually a blending of quite a few fairy tales, but in particular the dancing princesses that travel to the fairy realm every night and dance with the fair folk and then come back and no one understands where they've been or why they're so tired or their shoes are so worn out. And I really enjoyed that book. It was actually the first book I read by her. But I haven't read book 2, which follows a different sister from book 1. So a bit like Seven Waters, and then I've read the first book in the Shadowfell series, which is a YA trilogy, and this is the one set in ancient Scotland, although it's like a slightly alternative Scotland ruled by like an evil magical king. But it has a lot of elements of like Scottish folklore and I really enjoyed that. This one is much more like fast-paced and typical of the YA genre if you far prefer that. And any of those first books would actually make amazing places to start. But then for the 5th author on this list, who I've also read 12 books by, it's Tessa Dare, and it's kind of scary that I've already read 12 books by her because I literally only started reading her last year. So in the space of a year I've read 12 books. However, 4 of those were novellas and 8 of those were novels, and even the novels are so fast paced because they are Regency historical romances, and I find I just read romance really quickly. It's just so immersive. You get completely wrapped up in it and you speed through it because you're so invested in the relationships. Again, I've yet to dislike a book by Tessa Dare. I far prefer her novels to her novellas, and I think my least favourite books by her have been the 2 standalone novellas. I preferred the novellas that were part of series because they felt more part of a whole. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend starting with her standalone novellas. I would suggest starting with like the first book in one of her series. Says the woman who did not do that and completely read her first books by her out of order. So like with anything, I'm the kind of person that says start where you want to start, but if you're looking for recommendations, the series I have started are the Spindle Cove books, which I think is my favourite series of hers to date, and I've read almost all of the books in it. Basically, I've read the first 4 novels, 2 out of 3 of the novellas, and the only reason I haven't read the final novel yet is because it's a crossover with another series by her called Castles Ever After, so I'm currently in the process of reading some of those books, but I haven't actually read those in order either, I realise, because I've read books 1 and 3 in the Castles Ever After series. Now the thing about all of these series is that they all follow different protagonists in each book, so even though they're set like in the same, so even though a series might be set in the same like area and tend to follow groups of friends, like groups of female friends, which I really enjoy, they are about different couples in each book. So that's why it's never really bothered me that I've read them slightly out of order. And if I ever read a book that was set before one of the others, it just feels like a prequel, to be honest. But the Spindle Cove series is my favourite so far because it's set in this seaside town where women who don't quite feel like they fit in go. So maybe they are like incredibly shy and just can't bring themselves to attend balls or go dancing. Maybe they are like academics and feel out of place and in society, or maybe they've had something scandalous happen to them that means they've kind of been pushed out of society, and they all have their own interests. They're all these complex, wonderful women who have wonderful friendships with one another and are more than the relationships, although the relationships are so fun to read about. I've also read 3 books in the Girl Meets Duke series, which is going to be a 4-book series, but book 4 is not out yet, and I am so excited for its release because this one particularly follows like a close-knit group of 4 friends, and I'm already kind of invested in the protagonist of book 4 because I've met her in the previous 3 books. And I'm only now just realising that I've actually read 13 books by Tessa Dare because I finished one literally like a day ago. So that should have been boosted up above Juliet Marillier, but there we have it. I'm really concerned about how long this video is going to be. But next up we have something completely different, and that is Euripides. Now Euripides was an ancient Greek playwright who we actually have the greatest number of tragedies surviving from. So there are 3 main ancient Greek playwrights who we have real extant, like full-length plays surviving from, and those are Aeschylus, Sophocles and Euripides. But like I mentioned, we have more plays surviving from Euripides than the other 2, and because of that I've probably read the most by him, but I think he's also kind of my favourite. So in case you're curious, he has 19 plays that survive extant, 18 of which are tragedies. One of them is like a satyr play, and that also means I've read more than half, but it is a life goal to read them all. Of the ones I've read, hands down my favourite is The Trojan Women. It is such a harrowing read. It is about the women of Troy, the like aristocratic women of Troy, who were part of the royal family, mainly, and how the end of the Trojan War affects them. So once Troy has been defeated by the Greeks, they basically are about to become enslaved, and it's like this moment in the camp where they are having to process the loss of like their sons, their husbands, their brothers, and all of their male relatives, and look ahead to what their lives are about to become as enslaved women to the Greeks. And it's, like I said, so harrowing, but actually really well done. But generally speaking, I've found something interesting about most of the plays I've read by him. Hippolytus and Ion are both very interesting from the perspective of the area of ancient Greece that I research, and Rhesus is literally the most boring one of all the ones I've read. Don't start there, that's all I can say. We then actually have a friend of mine, because that is Jen Campbell. So a really good friend of mine on YouTube, Jen, has actually written quite a few books in very different genres, and it turns out I've read almost all of the ones that have been published. So she has a children's picture book series about Luna and Franklin, a little girl and a dragon who are friends and come together and go on these amazing adventures, all three of which I've read. I've read both her books in the Weird Things Customers Say in Bookshop series, which are non-fiction books collecting together odd things that customers said to Jen whilst she worked in bookshops, and they're completely hilarious. I actually read both those books before I knew Jen and really enjoyed them. I remember reading them when I was like writing essays at university and getting very stressed, and they were just like the perfect amount of like levity and like good humour that I needed in those moments of stress. So I really couldn't recommend those more highly. I've also read her short story collection, The Beginning of the World in the Middle of the Night, which is beautiful. Jen is a stunning writer, and there's lots of fairy tale themes throughout those stories, although they're not like fairy tale retellings. They're very much these imaginative, unique conjurings of Jen's brain, but also dealing with themes of like queerness and disfigurement, and like I said, just stunning. She's also a poet, and I have read her full-length poetry collection, The Girl Aquarium, as well as her poetry pamphlet that was published by the Rialto, and I'm now forgetting what it's called, The Hungry Ghost Festival. Apologies for forgetting that for a moment. And again, she's just a beautiful writer who has a beautiful way with stringing words together, and I think that really comes across in her poetry. It deals with similar themes as I've just mentioned in regard to her short story collection, which in total means that I have read 7 books by Jen, all of which are very different, but really wonderful in their own way. Another author I've read 7 books by is Roald Dahl. This is another one I had to kind of go back into my childhood memory to find. But like many children, I adored a Roald Dahl book when I was a kid. I know he has adult books, and I have read some of his short stories, but I've never read a collection in full, so I don't really think I can count any of his adult books to this number, making this exclusively children's book. But if you are curious of the ones I've read The Witches, Revolting Rhymes, Fantastic Mr. Fox, George's Marvellous Medicine, The Twits, The Enormous Crocodile, and The Magic Finger. Now, it's really difficult to pick a favourite because I used to reread every single one of these books. I had The Witches on audio cassette tape, and I would sit under my quilt in my dark bedroom with all the lights off and listen to it in order to get scared, because The Witches is terrifying, but in the most mesmerising way for a child. So I used to listen to that all the time. Similarly, I had like a double-sided cassette tape that had The Magic Finger and The Enormous Crocodile on it. So again, I would listen to that because I used to love listening to my audio cassette tapes. But then I would equally return to the physical books by him that I owned, which were The Twits, The Fantastic Mr. Fox, and George's Marvellous Medicine. Weirdly, when I was a kid, I think if you'd asked me, George's Marvellous Medicine was my absolute favourite. And that book is so weird. Basically the whole time this little boy is trying to poison his grandmother, but I thought it was brilliant. At the end of the day though, I don't think I could pick a favourite. I used to get Revolting Rhymes out of the library on repeat. So all of those books are just such fond memories for me as children, and I should probably read some of the ones I've never read. I know I've never read Matilda or Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or the BFG, but I guess because those were all ones I saw the films of as a kid, it never occurred to me to read the book. Same goes for James and the Giant Peach actually, so clearly if it was in a film form, I didn't read it, unless it was The Witches. And yes, I know there is now a film of the Fantastic Mr. Fox, but I don't like it. It is not the Fantastic Mr. Fox that I remember. We then have 2 more authors on this list who have made it to 6 books each, and I thought I would cut it off after that, because apparently there's a million authors I've read 5 or 4 books by, but the 2 authors I've read 6 books by each are Margaret Atwood and Jeanette Winterson. So Jeanette Winterson, interestingly, I've read 6 books by, all of which I adored, but I have DNF'd 2 books by her. So those I did not like, which is really interesting, I think, when you love, like passionately love books by one author but just don't get on with others. So off the top of my head, by Jeanette Winterson, I've read The Stone Gods, Wait, Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, Why Be Happy When You Can Be Normal, The Passion and Sexing the Cherry, all of which are very different but very similar. They all have Jeanette Winterson's very unique, surreal, magical writing style, which is what draws me to her work time and time again. But they're quite different because The Passion and Sex and the Cherry are basically historical novels. Sex and the Cherry is set during the time of Cromwell, and The Passion is set during the Napoleonic Wars. Stone Gods is a science fiction futuristic novel. Wait is a retelling of a Greek myth. Why Be Happy You Can Be Normal is actually the only non-fiction book I've read by her. It's her autobiography, and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit was her first novel, and it's set in 1950s Northern England, I believe, and it is basically autobiographical even though it's a novel. I loved each and every single one of those books. I'm trying to remember the name of the books I DNF'd by her. One was about witches, but I can't remember what it was called, which just goes to show how much it stuck with me. And the other one was Boating for Beginners, which I keep trying to read again, but like, there's a reason I think no one talks about that book. It's too weird. It's not enjoyable. And if you're looking for somewhere to start, I think it depends on what you like. I think that list demonstrates the diversity of the kind of books she writes. If you like a Greek myth retelling, Wait is incredible. It's probably one of my favourites. Equally, I think Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit is the one I would probably recommend above anything else. It is probably one of the best books I've ever read, so I would highly recommend that one. And then we have 6 books by Margaret Atwood, which are, I'm going to do this off the top of my head again, hopefully, Alias Grace, Cat's Eye, The Penelopiad, The Heart Goes Last, Hagseed, and The Handmaid's Tale. I'm not going to talk about Handmaid's Tale, everyone knows everything about that book at this point. The Penelopiad is my favourite. The Penelopiad is a retelling of the ancient Greek myth of Odysseus, but from his wife Penelope's perspective. It was the first Margaret Atwood book I read. It was also the first ever like adult Greek myth retelling I read. I think I was around 15 or 16. And it had a massive impact on me. And such a clever example of what you can do with a myth from a sort of modern perspective, and yeah, would highly recommend that book. I also loved Alias Grace, which seems to be a bit more of a Marmite. It's a sort of mystery novel based on the true story of a Canadian murderess. Really enjoyed that. Hagseed is a retelling of The Tempest set in modern day Canada in a men's prison, which I think was brilliant, so emotional, so fascinating, and I did very much enjoy The Handmaid's Tale when I read it. The Heart Goes Last and Cat's Eye I did not love so much. The Heart Goes Last was like interesting, but I didn't adore it. Cat's Eye I hated. Cat's Eye and Alias Grace I both ended up reading for school in my final year for English, and I loved Alias Grace, so it wasn't like I hated studying books. I just hated everything about Cat's Eye. To this day, it's like one of the books I remember the least fondly because of how viscerally I hated it at the time. And I always think that's also really interesting because I have loved most of what I've read by Margaret Atwood. Some of her books are my favourite books, like The Penelopiad, but I've also, you know, detested other books I've read by her, which I always just find really fascinating with authors when you read a lot of their work, how you can have very different reactions to each book. But those are the authors that I have read the most books by, who I have read books in different series by, like I mentioned. So Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and J.K. Rowling did not make it onto these lists. But I would love to hear what authors you've read the most of. What authors do you turn to time and time again? What authors have massive back catalogues that you've been working your way through? And do you love everything you've read by those authors? That's also something I would find really interesting. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye guys!